supposed to do this live, but I'm not doing a live video because if I do it live on my phone, then I would only be able to do it live on Instagram because I don't have enough, enough YouTube followers to go live. You feel me? And I want to be able to post the video. But a couple of days ago, I posted a video of a movie on YouTube, and my idea of posting the movie, I wasn't really thinking much about it, but my idea of posting the movie was to get individuals to read the their own synopsis of what the movie was entailing. You know what I'm saying? I wanted individuals to read the spectrum of the actual film and certain events in the movie and how it might play out in current time events. But the most important thing that I was trying to do was to specify the creativity in storytelling, if you will. Anywho, um, and then I felt a tug in my spirit. Some of the guys was like, "Man, you gotta read it to him, motherfucker. You can't just." So, but um, my biggest ideation is finding different avenues to push information that is very prevalent and very important on the basis of being able to conceptualize. So, anywho, I have this book, and this is a very powerful informational piece. It is called "The Light of the World" by Gerald Massey, and this book is I'm talking about information. And one thing that I respect about information is it is uh, unchanging. It is not circumstantial. It is not emotional. It is not situational. Information is information, and it does not change. So I want to read a few chapters of this book, and I want to be able to express a generalization of how past, present, and future play a part. But first, before I do that, I want to show y'all something because history and present and future have such a magnetized resemblance of one another that they nearly coexist and coincide with one another. So much so that we have to be almost keen to every sensibility to a insurmountable degree to separate the three dimensions of existence because we are all three simultaneously. And in separate realms, there's a separate level of time where we coexist with that existence as well. So, um, I was gonna show y'all a picture of what I'm saying, but I don't think it's gonna let me pull it up quick enough. It ain't gonna let me pull it up quick enough, and I'm not gonna wait for this computer to. But so, In the Light of the World by Gerald Massey, book one, and there's two volumes of this book. I recommend it's a very expensive, very pricey book, but I recommend for individuals who are real readers and really, 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 really like research and ancient chemetic sciences. Grab this book. It says the other day, a lad from London who had been taken to the seaside for the first time in his life was standing with his mother looking at the rolling breakers tossing and tumbling in upon the sands when he was heard to explain, "Oh mother, who is chucking them heaps of water about?" This expression showed the boy the ability to think of the power that was doing it. in the human likeness. But then, ignorant as he might be, he was more or less the heir to human faculty as it is manifested in all its triumphs over external nature in the present time. Now, it has been and still is a prevalent practicality, um, universal assumption that the same mental standpoint might have been occupied by primitive man and a like question asked in the presence of the same or similar phenomena of physical nature. Nothing is more common or more questioned than the inference that primitive man would or could have been asked, "Who is doing it?" and that the who could have been personified in the human likeness. Indeed, and let me pause for a second. He says the question could have been asked, "Who is doing it?" and that the who could have been personified in the human likeness. And that's where the sense of godness, in our nature to commune with that spiritual precedence, I believe comes from. Okay, it says, indeed, it has become an axiom with modern metaphysicians and a postulate of the anthropologist that from the beginning man is imposed his own human image upon external nature, that he personifies his elemental energies and fierce physical forces after his own likeness. Also, that this was in accordance with fundamental character and constitution of the human mind. To adduce a few examples, take almost at random, David Hume declared that there is a universal tendency among mankind to conceive all beings like themselves. When pause, when an individual sees a reflection of themselves in another individual, that concept is based on this tendency. So, in support of which he instances the seeing of human faces in the moon. Read read on the active powers. Read REID on the active powers. Fourth essay says our first thoughts are that the objects in which we beacon had long become remarked, that we human beings set stamps and seals of our own images upon God's creatures and works. Herbert Spencer argued that human personality applied to the powers of nature was the primitive mode of representation, and that the identification of this with some natural force or object is due to identity of name. In early philosophy throughout the world, says Mr. Taylor, so I have to flip these pages back and forth because the sun and the moon are alive and, as it were, human in their nature. Professor Max Mueller, who taught that mythology was a disease of language and that the myths have been made out of words which had lost their senses, asserts that the whole animal world has been conceived as a copy of our own. And not only the animal world, but the whole of nature was liable to be conceived and named by assimilation to human nature, past, present, and future being a conduit of simultaneousness, creating the frequency and the flow of existence on a competitive timeline. And such was the propensity in the earliest men of whom we have any authentic record to see personal agency in everything, that it could not be otherwise, for there was really no way of conceiving or naming anything objective except after the simulation of the subjective or of ourselves. Illustration of this modern position might be indefinitely multiplied. The assumption has been supported by a consensus of assertion, and here, as elsewhere, the present writer is compelled to doubt, deny, and disprove the popular postulate of the accepted orthodox authorities. That said, the lion is your version of the story. Let us be sculptors, and for the lion under the feet of a man, you shall see a dozen men beneath the pad of one lion. Myth making man did not create the gods in his own image. Myth making man did not create the gods in his own image. The primitive deities of Egypt, such as Sut, Sebek, and Shu, three of the earliest, were represented in the likeness of the hippopotamus, the crocodile, and the lion, whilst Hapi was imaged as an ape, Anoop as a jackal, Ptah as a beetle, Tat as an ibis, Seb as a goose. So was it with the goddesses. They are the likeness of powers that were superhuman, not human. Hence, Apt was imagined as the water cow, Heket as a frog, and Tefnut as the lioness. Cirque as a scorpion, Renut as a serpent, Hathor as a fruit tree. A huge mistake has been hither been made in assuming that the myth makers began by fashioning the nature powers in their own human likeness. Totemism was formulated by myth making man with types that were the very opposite of human. And in any mythology, the representation was preceded by the whole menagerie of totemic zoo types. Oh, here go this page again. Pause. The idea of force, for instance, was not derived from the thews and muscles of man. As the Kamite sign language shows, the force that was chucking them heaps of water about was perceived to be the wind, the spirit that moved upon the face of the waters from the beginning. This power was divinized in Shu, the god of breathing force, whose zoo type is the lion, as a fitting figure of this panting power of the air. Henceforth, you got air signs. Gemini, Libra, Aquarius. Okay, moving along. The element audible in the howling wind, but dimly apprehended otherwise, was giving shape and substance as the roaring lion in this substitution of similars. The force of the thews and sinews could compare with those of the lion as a figure of force. Thus, the lion speaks for itself in the language of ideographic signs. And in this way, the gods and the goddesses of ancient Egypt were at first portrayed as superhuman powers by means of living superhuman types. If primitive man had projected the shadow of himself upon external nature to shape its elements, forces in his own image, or if the unfeatured vast had unveiled to him any likeness of the human face, then the primary representation of natural powers, which became the latter divinities, ought to have been anthropomorphic, and the likeness reflected in the mirror of the most ancient mythologies should have been human. Whereas the powers and divinities were first represented by animals, birds, and reptiles, or to employ a word that includes all classes. They were portrayed by means of zootypes. The sun and the moon were not considered human in their nature. When the one who was imagined as a crocodile, a lion, a bull, a beetle, or a hawk, and the other as a hare, a frog, and an ape, or an ibis, as they are represented in the Egyptian hieroglyphs by means of zootypes until horror Harur, the elder Horus, had been depicted as the child in place of the calf or lamb, the fish or shoot of the papyrus plant, which was comparatively late. There was no human figure personalized in the mythology of Egypt. Primitive or Paleolithic man was too beggarly poor in possessions to dream of shaping the superhuman powers of nature in the human likeness. That's cosmic. There is one all sufficient reason why he did not. He simply could not. And if and it is precisely because the makers of the myths had not the power to animate the universe in their own likeness that we have the zoomorphic mode of representation as the sign language of totemism and mythology. On every line of research, we discovered that the representation of nature was pre anthropomorphic at first. As we see ongoing back far from, as we see on going back far enough, and on every line of descent, the zoomorphic passes ultimately into the human representation. The modern metaphysicians have so developed the faculty of abstract and the disease of subjectivity that their own mental operations offer no true guidance for generalizations concerning the primitive or early man who thought in things and almost apprehended with the physical sense alone. They overlook the fact that imagining by means of object pictures preceded the imaging so often ascribed to primitive man. These did not busy themselves and bother their brains with all sorts of vagrant fancies instead of getting an actual grasp of the homeliest facts. It was not primitive man, but two German metaphysicians who were looking out of a window at a falling shower of rain when one of them remarked, "Perhaps it is I who am doing that." Or I, chimed in the other. The present writer once had a cat before whom he placed a sheet of polished tin. The cat saw herself reflected as a mirror and looked for a short time at her own image. For far as sight and appearance went, this might have been another cat, but she proceeded to apply the comparative process and test one sense by another, deliberately smelling at the likeness to find out if any cat was there. Pause. Past, present, future, simulation of coexistence, and the connotation of time being the conduit of how do I put it? Cause and effect. You feel me? So when I was saying that we see reflections of ourselves in individuals, right? That is also an expression, a greater expression of that fact. So she did not sit down as a non verifying visionary to formulate hypotheses or conjure up the ghost of a cat. Her sense of smell told her that, as a matter of fact, there was no other cat present. Therefore, she was not to be misled by a false appearance in which she took no further interest, that we may infer was more like the action of primitive man, who would find no human likeness behind the phenomena or external nature. Indeed, man was so generally represented by the animals that the appearance could be mistaken for a primitive belief that animals were his ancestors. But the powers, let me flip a page. The powers first perceived in external nature were not only unlike human, they were very emphatically, excuse me, and distinctly more than human, and therefore could not be adequately expressed by features recognizable as mere human. Primitive men were all too objectively helpless in presence of these powers to think of them or to conceive them in their own similitude. Similitude. Excuse me. I have never pronounced that word out loud. The one primordial and most definite fact of the whole matter was the distinct and the absolute unlikeness to themselves. Also, they themselves were too little the cause of anything by the work of their own hands to enter into the sphere of causation mentally. They could only apprehend the nature forces by their effects and try to represent these by means of other powers that were present in nature, by which were also necessarily superior to the human and were not human faculties indefinitely magnified. The human being could only impress his own image on external nature in proportion to his mastery over natural conditions. He could not have figured the thunderbolt as a stone axe in the hands of destroying power until he himself had made and could wield the axe of stone as the weapon of his own power. But he could think of it in likeness of the serpent already known to him in external nature as a figure of fatal force. An ignorant explanation of the Egyptian sign language was begun by the Greeks who could not read the hieroglyphs. It was repeated by the Romans and has been perpetuated by classic scholars excuse me, ever since. But as the interpreter of Egypt, that kind of scholastic knowledge is entirely obsolete. Ignorance of primitive sign language has been and is as a fertile source of false belief. For example, Juvenal asks, who does not know what kind of monsters Egypt insanely worships? And having seen or heard of the long-tailed ape in an Egyptian temple, the satirist assumed without question that this animal was set up as an object of worship. He did not know that ape itself was the worshiper as an image in sign language and the saluter of the gods. Ani, the name of a particular ape, denotes the saluter, and the salute was an Egyptian gesture of adoration. The ape or the cynocephalus, I'm going to spell that Cynocephalus, with its paws uplifted in a typical worship as saluter of the light. It was and still is looked upon in Africa generally as a pre-human moon worshiper who laments and bewails the disappearance of its nightlight and rejoices at the renewal and the return of that luminary. In the vignettes to the ritual Ani, the ape is a saluter. Okay, hold on. In the vignettes, the ritual Ani, the ape is the saluter of the rising sun, that is of Ra, upon the mount of sunrise. One of the most profound perversions of the past has been made misapprehending this primitive sign language for what is designated worship, whether as sun worship, serpent worship, tree worship, or phallic worship. The tree, for example, is a type, but the type is not necessarily an object of worship, as misunderstood by those who do not read the types when these are rooted in the ground of natural fact. The forest folk were dwellers in the trees or in the bush. The tree that had gave them food and shelter grew to be an object of regard. Hence it became a type of Mother Earth as a birthplace and abode. Hence Hathor was the hut or the house of Horus Har in the tree. But worship is a word of cant employed by writers who are ignorant of sign language in general. Such phrases as stock and stone worship explain nothing and are worse than useless. The mother and the child of all mythology are represented in the tree and branch. The tree was a type of abode. The roof tree, the mother of food and drink, the giver of life and shelter, the wet nurse in the dew or rain, the producer of offspring as the branch and promise of periodic continuity. Was it the tree then the Egyptians worshiped, or the giver of food and shelter in the tree, or the Apis stele in the Berlin Museum who two priests are saluting the Apis bull. This is designed Apis worship. But the Apis carries the solar disk betwixt its horns. This also is being saluted, which then is the object of worship. There are two objects of religious regard, but neither is the object of adoration. This is the God in spirit who was represented as the soul of life in the sun and in the tree. Also, by the fecundating bull. In this and a thousand other instances, it is not a question of worship but of sign language. Nor did mythology spring from 50 or 100 different sources, as frequently assumed. It is one as a system of representation, one as a mode of thought, one as a mode of expression, and all its great primordial types are virtually universal. Neither do the myths that were inherited and represented for ages by the later races of men afford any direct criterion to the intellectual statues of such races. A mythical representation may be savage without those who preserve it being savages. When the Egyptians in the time of Unas, speak of the deities devouring the souls, it is no proof of their being cannibals at the time. Mythology has had an almost limitless descent. It was in a savage or crudity primitive state in the most ancient Egypt, but the Egyptians who continued to repeat the myths did not remain savages. The same mythical mode of representing nature that was probably extinct was that was probably extant in Africa 100,000 years ago. Survivors today amongst races who are no longer the producers of myths and marching than they are of language itself. Egyptian mythology is the oldest in the world, and it did not begin as an explanation of natural phenomena, but as a representation by such primitive means as were available at the time. It does not explain that the sun is a hawk, or the moon a cat, or the solar god a crocodile. Such figures of fact belong to the symbolic mode of rendering in the language of animals of zoo types. No better definition of myth or mythology could be given than a conveyed by the word semi in Egyptian. This signifies representation on the ground of likeness. Mythology, then, is representation on the ground of likeness, which led to all forms of sign language that could ever be employed. The matter has been touched upon in previous volumes, but for the purpose of completeness, It has been demonstrated in the present work that external nature was primarily imaged in the pre-human likeness. It was the same here as in external nature. The animals came first, and the pre, the predecessors of man are primary in sign language, mythology, and totemism. It is quite certain that if a primitive method has been conceptual, an early man had possessed the power to impose the likeness of human personality upon external phenomena, it would have been in an image of a male as a type or in types of power, whereas the primal human personification is the likeness of the female. The page, the great mother. Let me pause for a second, cause I ain't got nothing to sip on. I should have brought me something to drink, but I didn't. The great mother as the primal parent in a universal type. There could be no divine father in heaven until the fatherhood was individualized on earth. Again, if primitive men had been able to impose the human likeness on the mother nature, the typical wet nurse would have been a woman. But it is not so. The woman comes last. She was preceded by the beast itself, the soul, the hippopotamus or lioness, and by the female form that wears the head of the zoo type, the cow, the frog or serpent, on the body of a divinity. Moreover, the human likeness would or necessity have been included sex, but the earliest powers recognized in nature are represented as being of no sex. It is said in Akkadian hymns, female they are not, male they are not. Therefore, they were not imagined in, and they were not imaged in the human likeness. The elements of air, earth, water, and fire, darkness, and light are of no sex, and the powers first recognized in them, whether as deconstructive or uh, beneficent, are consequently without sex. So far from nature having been conceived or imaged as a non natural man in a mass with features more or less human, however, hugely magnified, the mass of human personality was the latest that was fitted to the face of external nature. Mass were applied to all face of nature in the endeavor to feature and visibly present some likeness of the operative elemental forces and manifesting powers of air, fire, water, earth, thunder, and lightning, darkness and dawn, eclipse and earthquake, sandstorm, or the drowning waters of the dark. But these masks were zoomorphic, not human. They imagined the most potent, devouring beast, most cunning of reptiles, most powerful birds of prey. In these monstrous masks, we see the primal powers of nature all at play, as in the pantomime, which still preserves a likeness to primordial representation of external nature that is now chiefly known under the names of mythology and totemism. The elemental powers operant in external nature were superhuman in the past as they are in the present. The voice of thunder, the death stroke of lightning, the coup de le soleil, the force of fire or of water and flood, the wind and hurricane were superhuman. So if animals and birds, the powers of the hippopotamus, the crocodile, the serpent, the hawk, the lion, the jackal, and the ape were superhuman, and therefore they were adopted as zoo types and as primary representatives of the superhuman powers of the elements. Now, pause. What's interesting about this is all of these animals still coexist with multiple lifetimes, multiple life cycles, multiple incarnations, multiple recreations and creations and they say the world they say civilization had been destroyed and rebuilt itself multiple millennia and multiple lifetimes over and over and over again. um so the ideation that past, present, and future are one sequence of a continuum. This is the representation of that expression. So, yeah. So, they were adopted as primitive ideographs. They were adopted for use and consciously stamped for their representation value, not ignorantly worshipped, as thus they became the coins, as it were, in the current medium of exchange for the expression of primitive thought or feeling. Sign language includes the gesture signs by which the mysteries were danced or otherwise dramatized in Africa by the pygmies and the bushmen in totemism, in fetishism, and in hieroglyphic symbols. Very little of which language has been read by those who are continually treading water in the shallows of subject without ever touching bottom of attaining foothold in the depths. It is by means of sign language that the Egyptian wisdoms keep the records of the prehistoric past. The Egyptian hieroglyphs show us the connection betwixt words and things, also betwixt sounds and words, in a very primitive range of human thought. There is no other such a record known in the world. Um, they consist largely of human gesture signs and the sounds first made by animals such as ba for the goat, or meow for the cat, or su for the goose, and fu for the sarasi's sake snake. I did a horrible incantation of that, but nevertheless, um, but the Kamite representation by means of sign language had begun in inner Africa before the talking animals, birds, and reptiles had been translated into forms of gods and goddesses by the dwellers of the valley and the Nile. The living audiographs or zootypes were primary and can be traced to the original habitat and home, and to nowhere else upon the surface of the earth. The cow or the waters there represented the earth mother as the great bringer forth of life. Before she was divinized as Apt, the goddess in human guise, with the head of a hippopotamus. Pause. You see how even in futuristic Kemetic informational text also plays a very formative present time. That's why it's important to not be in offense of these occurrences, because they play a greater part of the whole, a greater picture. This is powerful information. This is powerful information. Um, the overseeing giraffe, or as it is, or the overseeing giraffe, or was it the Oka, Okapi, OKAPI? Let me reread that. The overseeing giraffe, or was it the Okapi? Or Soot, the hawk, or Horus, the calf ape, or Tat An, the white vulture of Neith, the jackal, or Anoop, and 50 others were pre-extant at the talking animals before they was delineated in semi-human guise as gods and goddesses or elemental powers, thus figured forth in the form of birds and beasts, of fish and reptiles. Zoo types were extant in nature as figures, ready molded pictures readily made, hieroglyphics and ideographs that moved about alive, pictures that were earlier than painting, statues that preceded sculpture, living nature types that were employed when there were no other known to art. Certain primordial types originated in the old dark land of Africa. I need a simple something. These were perfected in Egypt, and thence dispersed about the world. Amongst them is the earth as solid ground amidst the water, of surrounding them in the earth as surrounding them in space, or as the bridge forth of life, depicted as a water cow, possibly the cow of Kintu in Uganda, the dragon of darkness, or other wide-jawed swallower of the light, that rose up from the abyss and coiled about the mount of earth at night as the devourer, the evergreen tree of dawn, the preeminently African that arises on the horizon upon the mount of earth from out the waters of space, the opposing elemental powers beginning with the twins of light, the darkness who fought in earth and heaven and the nether world, the great earth mother of nature powers, the seven children of her womb, and various types that are one in origin and worldwide in their range. When the solar force was yet uncomprehended, the sinking sun could be imaged naturally enough by the beetle boring in its way through the earth, or by the tortoise that buried itself in the soil. Also, the crocodile making its passage through the waters, or the golden hawk that soared up through the air. This was representing the phenomena in external nature, or the ground of likeness, when it could not imagine directly by the means of words. When it is held as in Australia that the lizard first divinized the sexes, as that it was also the author of marriage, we have to assertion that the lizard signified the sign language. And then when we find that, like the serpent or the frog, it denoted the female period, we see how it distinguished or divided the sexes, and in what sense it authorized or was author of totemic marriage. Because of its being a sign or symbol of feminism substance, it is said by Amazulu that when old women pass away, they take a form of a kind of a lizard. This can only be interpreted by knowing the ideographic value in the primitive system of sign language, in which the lizard was a zoo type. Flips the page. Appeared at puberty, but it disappeared at the turn of life, and with the old women went the disappearing lizard. The frog, which transformed from the tadpole condition, was another ideograph of female pubis. This may be illustrated by a story that was told sometime since Mitzweiner in the Contemporary Review, which contains a specimen of primitive thought and its mode of expression in perfect survival. It happened that a native girl at a Blantyre mission was called by her mistress, a missionary wife, to come and take charge of the baby. Her reply was, Nashafulini, Nashafulini is not there. She is turned into a frog. She could not come for a reason of tapu, but said no typically in the language of animals. She had made the transformation which first occurs when the young girl changes into a woman. She might have said she was a serpent or a lizard, and that she was a flower. But the frog that changed from a tadpole was also a type of her transformation, and she had figuratively become a frog for a few days of seclusion. Similarly, the member of a totem also became a frog, a beetle, a bull, or bear as a mode of representation, but not because the human being changed into the animal. The same thing which are said at a later stage by the ideographic uh, determinatives in the Egyptian hieroglyphs has been expressed previously by the inner African zoo types or living beasts, birds, reptiles, as may be seen in stories that told the talking animals by Bushmen. The original records still suffice to show that the physical agencies or forces first perceived were not conceived or mentally embodied in the human likeness, and that external nature offered no looking glass for the human face. To take the very illustration adduced by Hume, the original man in the moon did not depend upon any fancied resemblance to the human face. The Egyptian man in the moon, Tot or Tehuti, Greek Thoth, had the head of an ibis or the cynocephalus. There goes that word again. Both ibis and cynocephalus were lunar types which preceded any human likeness, and these were continued as heads to the human figure after this had been adopted. The man in the moon, who is Tot or Kunsu in Egypt, has a series of predecessors in the dog or cynocephalus, the ibis, the beetle, or the ideographic figures in lunar phenomena. As natural fact, the ibis was a famous fisher of the Nile, and its familiar figure was adopted as a zoo type of Tot, the lunar god, where the modern saw the new moon with the old moon in her arm. The Egyptians saw the ibis fishing up the old bark orb from out the waters with the crescent of its curving beak as the recoverer and savior of the drowning light. The moon was not looked upon as having any human likeness when it was imaged as or by the cat who saw in the dark. The hare that rose up by night and went round the horizon by leaps and bounds, the ibis as the returning birds of passage and messenger of the inundation, the frog that transformed from the tadpole, the old beetle that renewed itself in the earth to come forth the young one, or the cow that gave rebirth to the child of light as her calf. The sun was not conceived as human in its nature. When the solar force at dawn was imagined by the lion faced Atum, the flame of its furnace by the fiery serpent Iuati, the soul of its life by the hawk, the ram, or the crocodile, which are five Egyptian zoo types, and a fivefold disproof of the sun being conceived as or considered human in its nature or similitude. In beginning an ab ovo, our first lesson is to learn something of the symbolical language of animals and to understand that what it is they once said as zoo types, we have then to use that knowledge in simplifying the mysteries of mythology. This primitive language is still employed in diverse forms. It is extant in the so-called dead language of the hieroglyphs, the ideographs, the pictographs, in the totemic types and figures of tattoo, in the portraiture of the nature powers in which come to be divinized at length in the human likeness as gods and goddesses of mythology. And in that language of folk fables still made use of the Bushmen, the the Hotentos, and the Africans, in which the jackal, the dog, the lion, the crane, the white vulture, and other beasts and birds keep on talking as they did in the beginning and continue more or less to say in human speech what they once said in primitive symbolism. That is, they fulfill the same characters in the marching that were first founded in the mythos. It has now to be shown how the mythical mode of representing natural phenomena has based upon its primitive system of thought and expression, and how the things that were thought and expressed of old in this language continue the primary stratum of what is called mythology today. So I'm gonna put a bookmark right here, right? And my phone is on like 10%, so I'm gonna dash up out of here. But if you like this information, if you like my deliverance of this information, I will be happy to continue to read these very difficult texts and decipher. The research of the great Gerald Massey. Most importantly, it is important to understand that everything is as it is, and to um, be in understanding that we are connoisseurs of everything that is, um, both both land and water alike, both animal and human alike, both cosmic and spiritual alike. So we have no room for offense in reality, in any truth, especially as it pertains to circumstantial existence and or solidified existence. So this information, if you like it, if you fuck with it, if you fuck with it, you know what I'm saying? If you fuck with it, I will continue. You know what I'm saying? If it's like, this information ain't for me, then cool. Let me, you know what I mean? Yeah, figure out a way to let me know. But this low key had rule. You know what I'm saying? Low key had rule. You feel me? So yeah,